Step into the Gardener's Lodge with me, Mykal Hall. Let's explore the fascinating worlds of gardening, nature, and ecology through conversations with experts, thought leaders, passionate enthusiasts, and of course, some real good friends. All from the cosy heart of the lodge. Come on in. Hi and welcome to today's show. I have an amazing guest lined up for us, but first I have our new segment, which is, I guess, called Ask Mykal. And today I have a question which I have somewhat kind of linked to today's episode. Today's question comes from TJ, and they ask, I have moss that consistently grows throughout my lawn. I really want just a nice, lush, grassy lawn, but I can't seem to manage it. No matter what I do, the moss comes back. Do you have any tips or advice to achieving just a lovely lawn? So, TJ, I can infer some things about this space without actually seeing it. You've got moss growing in the lawn. So, what that says to me is that you are trying to have a lawn in a shady position, which is never very easy. It also says to me that your ground is potentially compacted and that there is quite a lot of moisture in the environment. So, three things that aren't conducive to a lovely lawn. Now, I would say give up. If the moss is there and the moss is green, you can still mow it to keep it under control. It's green, it's soft underfoot. Yes, it's probably a little bit moist from time to time, but you're not going to have a particularly successful time growing grass or lawn in this area. You could try to include some other species in that area. So if you did get rid of the moss, you could put in some more ground covery things that don't mind a bit of the shade. I'm thinking like Australian native violets are great. I believe you are located in Australia, or kidney weed, which does like a little bit of a sunnier spot, but it could take that kind of part shade. The two of those mixed together could make a nice ground cover lawn space that can still be mowed. You would be better suited to learning to love your mossy lawn, appreciate the environment that you do have, avoid using chemicals in the environment because you can get chemicals that will kill the moss. I would highly, highly recommend that you don't bother doing that. Love your moss, enjoy your moss. Use your moss pushing a mower through moss can be challenging if you let it go too long, but once you get it down, it should stay nice and compact and look actually quite nice and cute, and people do appreciate it. You could otherwise turn it into garden bed and mulch over it. The moss will still probably come back in time. You could try and aerate your soil with a garden fork, just kind of going through, putting your fork in and giving it a wriggle and pulling it out without fully disturbing the soil, just getting a bit more aeration through it. That'll help a little bit as well. But really, I would truly just try and learn to love the mossy lawn you've got. I actually wrote an article on my website on mongrel lawns, which you can check out. And I go back and edit this and include a section on mossy lawns. But it's sort of about embracing a mixed species lawn that might include things that aren't grass but are green and offer a lot to biodiversity, and how to, again, change that mindset about like what the perfect lawn is. Because to me, the perfect lawn is a monoculture and isn't a very healthy environment and needs a lot more work than it's worth. So that was Ask Mykal. If you'd like to ask me a question, head to thegardenerslodge.co.uk/podcast. There's a form there and you can pop in a question and I will endeavour to answer it next time. But on with the show. In today's episode, I speak with lichenologist April Windle. She's the co-chair of the Education and Promotions Committee at the British Lichen Society. So that's right, today's episode is all about lichens, and April has a wealth of knowledge. She literally had my brain exploding the entire episode. I knew very little about this subject. I knew that that it was two organisms that had a symbiotic relationship, but I really didn't know much more than that. And I knew that they grew all over the place. But today's episode, we dive deep into lichens, all the way from what they are, how they grow, through to their cultural and historical uses and their potential future uses in the pharmaceutical industry. And she tells us how lichens can be used to tell the health of an environment. But before we get into that, let's hear April's 6 rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Favourite plant?
Favourite plant or favourite lichen?
Well, I'll let you be the judge of that if
It's
you have
got
a
to be a
favourite lichen.
lichen. It's definitely got to be
Okay.
a lichen. So my favourite lichen, the first one that comes to mind is it's called the rock tripe or Lasalia postulata.
Favourite way to connect with nature?
Getting up into the mountains. And the reason for that, I feel it's the only way my brain becomes quiet.
Me too, just for the record.
You like the mountains
um,
as well?
I'm definitely a mountain goat.
Oh,
So,
yeah, amazing.
what is the most beautiful garden or natural landscape that you've ever visited?
Without a shadow of a doubt, has to be the Borrowdale Valley in the Lake District.
Okay, next question, and I'm going to alter it for you. It's usually favorite garden tool, but favorite tool of the trade.
The favourite tool of the trade, without a shadow of a doubt, has to be my hand lens.
Yeah. If you could be one, a plant or an animal,
I would be a
or a
lichen, so
lichen.
neither.
Yeah.
I would be a
Love that.
lichen.
And finally, when you're stuck and looking for research on anything garden or nature related, where do you go for the most trusted advice?
I actually go to the British Lichen Society and individuals who are part of the society.
Perfect.
As far back as I can remember, I've always had a real love for the natural world. And my parents have really shaped that actually. And my earliest memories are where they used to take me fossil hunting and fossil collecting on the Jurassic Coast. And for
So
anyone
good.
that's familiar with that stretch, it's so incredibly rich. And that's definitely shaped my love for nature. From a young age, it's always been a hobby. I've always gone out on walks and looked at invertebrates and looked at birds through my binoculars. But I'm fortunate enough now to have actually turned that hobby into a career where I work in the sector. And I'm currently a freelance lichenologist. I've had my own business now for the last 5, 6 years. And I go across Britain and Ireland basically doing lichen surveys and visiting some of the most remarkable habitats that we have in this country. And I have to pinch myself sometimes that this is actually my job. And I deeply believe that I've got the best career in the world where I get to work my hobby every day, basically.
Lichenologist. So I presume there's not that many lichenologists around, particularly in Britain. Um, and it's such a niche little kind of career that you've been able to dig out for yourself. Pardon the pun. And where did you first actually notice lichens, and why were you drawn to lichens beyond other sections of the natural world?
I first got into lichens when I just finished university, and I had this amazing opportunity presented to me where I was involved in an internship working for Exmoor National Park for 2 years.
Cool.
My role was very, very desk based when I was based at the national park, and I was managing the environmental records and biological records, and doing a lot of GIS work. So I was at my computer pretty much every day. But where the office was situated in Dulverton, there was this amazing stretch of riparian oakwood along the River Barle, a prime example of Atlantic woodland. And there was one day I went for my daily lunchtime walk, and it was just after a massive storm the night before. And this storm had brought the entire canopy down to the woodland floor. And there was a branch which was about 1.5 meters long, and it was absolutely festooned in these weird little life forms, all different shapes, different sizes, different colors. And at the time, I had absolutely no idea what they were, but I just knew that I was absolutely besotted by what I was seeing. I didn't even realize species and life forms like this existed. So, what I did is I dragged in the rain this huge branch back to the office to the ecologist. And I said, Ali, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. What are all these things on this branch? And she said, oh, April, these are called lichens, and they're a really important component of Exmoor's natural heritage. But the problem is, not very many people study them and not many people know about lichens.
Mm.
So study them and enjoy them because they're absolutely beautiful. And that's exactly what I did. And with lichens, it was very much a case of the more you read, the more it fuels your interest. And I started learning about them being a symbiotic life form. I read about their
Mm.
ability to indicate the quality of air. I read about the fact that they're jam packed full of these chemicals which have biomedical properties. And that was it. I was absolutely hooked. I went on this day course by a lady called Pat Wolseley, who was a bit of an inspiration of mine at the time and is now a really, really good friend and mentor. And I went on this day course and that was it. I was
you were
absolutely
you
sold.
were
And
hooked.
I was just absolutely fascinated by lichens. And that was about 8 or 9 years ago now.
For people who are listening and don't know necessarily what a lichen is it a moss? How would you actually describe a lichen?
There tends to be a little bit of confusion when it comes to lichens because most people actually think that lichens are plants. And I can
Yeah.
see that. They're very plant like in appearance. They're green, they're shrubby, and they photosynthesize. However, lichens are not plants. They actually sit within the biological kingdom fungi. So they are a
Mm.
fungus. And recent genetic studies have shown that lichens are actually more closely related genetically to animals and humans than they are to plants, which I think is
Really?
absolutely fascinating. But these fungi, they've adopted this really specific lifestyle or behavior where they partner up with either an algae or a photosynthetic bacteria, which we call a cyanobacteria.
Mhm.
And only when you get all these different life forms come together do you get this physical unit that we call a lichen. So, when you have different species interacting and coexisting with one another, we call it a symbiotic relationship or a symbiosis. And all this basically means is you've got a life form which is comprised of multiple different species. So lichens really fit the definition of an ecosystem more than they do a species or an organism because they
Mm.
are composite. They're made up of lots of different parts. And these different parts play a really important role for the survival of these lichens.
Does that make the term lichen a little bit redundant, being that they are multiple different beings that come together to form this?
Lichens are basically a fungus, so I wouldn't necessarily say it makes them redundant. However, it's just a group of fungi that have chose lichenization, so partnering up with an algae as a mode of survival. So fungi are what we call heterotrophic organisms, which means they don't have the ability to make their own food. They can't produce their own carbohydrates. They have to tap into another source. And
Mhm.
that's why you see fungi growing, in your gardens where they take carbohydrates and carbon from the soil. You see them growing on dead trees where they take carbon from the trees.
From the
But
rotting materials, yeah.
rotting material, exactly. But these lichenized fungi, all they've done is they've said, hey, these algae and these cyanobacteria are producing carbohydrates for us. So let's tap into them and exploit these autotrophic organisms. So, what I mean by
Ah.
autotrophic is they have the ability to make their own food, make their own carbohydrates. They take energy from the sunshine.
So
They
through
phot-
photosynthesis.
exactly through photosynthesis, and that is what the fungi taps into. I always call these algae the sunshine eating life forms,
Yeah.
which is quite a nice way of looking at it because they do, they essentially take sun and produce the food that the carbohydrates need. And this actually brings into question, well, what is the relationship between the two? What form of symbiosis is this? Because there's lots of
Yeah.
different types of symbiosis. So the most renowned one is parasitism, where one species is really benefiting to the detriment of the other. So, an argument for that is that these fungi are absolutely dependent on the algae or cyanobacteria for carbohydrates. And some people say that these fungi are actually farming the algae, because what the algae cannot do is reproduce like it would in its free living state. And these algae can live, outside of the lichen association, but the fungus is absolutely dependent because it needs those carbohydrates. And then to flip it on the other side, another form of symbiosis is mutualism, where all of these different species in the relationship are benefiting. And I think that's a really lovely, cuddly, cute concept. And that's where I
Yeah.
would like to think that lichens sit, but it's probably not the case. But obviously, fungi are benefiting because they get their food. But some people say that the algae or the cyanobacteria are benefiting because they can actually expand and extend their geographic range and can occupy habitats that they wouldn't be able to in their free living state.
Okay.
With algae, if you think about them, they tend to live in quite damp, wet, shaded habitats. But in the
Yes.
lichen association, they can occupy the summits of the mountains where they're exposed to sunlight the majority of the time. So it's quite a long and very unsolved
Right.
debate. And actually, it is probably a spectrum across different species where different lichens take a different symbiotic approach.
That is absolutely fascinating. I actually had no idea, to be honest. So there you go. I knew that it was a symbiotic relationship, but I didn't quite understand, yeah, what the push and pull between the two species were. But yeah, I suppose that makes sense that they would be able to expand their geographic range while the fungi is kind of being able to feed. Very cool.
Yeah.
Do you have a sunny space in your garden that you just don't know what to do with? Well, I have a treat for you. A free perennial garden design that you can download right now. It's full of colour and year-round interest, and the best part is that it's pollinator and wildlife attracting. It's been designed with the UK climate in mind, but I know I've got listeners across the globe. So if you're in the southern states of Australia or the northern part of the US, this is the design for you. You can download your free perennial garden design, as well as my free Australian native garden design, at the link in the description.
But what's really interesting is they've done studies in the past to see if these fungi can live independently without the algae. And they've actually germinated fungal spores in laboratory conditions. And when these spores germinate and the fungus develops, it just turns into this big lump of gloop. It's completely amorphous, it's got no shape
Oh.
whatsoever. And that just emphasizes the importance of this algae in creating this physical shape that we see, which is what we call the lichen.
So they really are just dependent on each other. It's not as though they can really live independently.
So, generally speaking, most fungi within the lichen association have never been seen in a free living state and growing independently. But
Interesting.
many species of algae and cyanobacteria, which you find in the symbiotic relationship, have been found growing in a free living state and independently. So the fungus is completely dependent on the algae, but the algae and the cyanobacteria is less dependent on the fungus, I think. But
Yeah,
the
okay.
fungus does definitely provide shelter and protection for the algae.
So let's go into then the life cycle of the lichens. Obviously, you've got this symbiotic relationship, but then does the fungi kind of put out a fruiting body like it would if it was like a ground dwelling or a wood dwelling fungi?
Lichen reproduction is very complex, but as a field lichenologist, and when you're looking at these lichens in your garden or in a woodland, they have very distinct reproductive features which we can use to aid the identification of these lichens. And they tend to take two different approaches in terms of reproducing. Lichens are a fungus, as I've already said, and some of them produce these fantastic fruiting bodies, which we refer to as apothecia or perithecia. And
Okay.
these fruiting bodies are absolutely jam packed with spores. And these spores are the single reproductive units of the lichen. So, in most plants, the equivalent would be seeds, but fungi use spores to reproduce, and that's what contains all of the genetic material.
Mm-hmm.
However, not all lichens reproduce by fruits. Some of them reproduce asexually or vegetatively, and this is basically where small fragments of the lichen break off, blow off, get transported by animals, and then colonize a new area. And these can be seen as what we call ceridia, which are these powdery propagules. They give the lichen a real powdery appearance across the surface. But they can also be seen as acidia, and these are tiny little finger-like projections, which are an extension of the upper cortex, and they have to be physically broken off by a bird, for example, and they then get transported into the surrounding environment and colonize a new area. And
Oh,
where they reproduce vegetatively is obviously an extremely effective means of reproduction, because you're working with a pre-made package of lichen. These pre-made propagules contain both the fungus and the algal component. So it's essentially a clone of its parent, and they will just blow off and colonize where they need to. But
okay.
with the spores, when they get released from the fungal fruits, the spore contains the fungal component only. So the spore has to blow off in the surrounding environment, land on a suitable surface, find an algal partner in the vicinity. So when that spore
Yeah.
germinates, it can actually incorporate the algae, and then it can start to grow.
Wow.
Therefore, with this, the chances are much lower for a successful to successfully reproduce.
Mm.
So this is why you find millions of spores jam packed in these fruiting bodies, because it really is all down to chance as to whether they find an algal partner or not. There are some species that actually, it's been shown that when the spore is released from the fruit, they take a little algal cell with it, which
Okay.
is quite a neat approach. But for the majority, it's the spores get released and then they've
And then
got
they've
to
got to find their
find
own.
exactly.
Yeah. Wow. My brain's whirling right now.
If you wanted something to compare them to in the natural world, the closest resemblance in terms of the symbiosis is coral. So when you're working with
Okay.
coral, you're working with a polyp, which is an animal, and that polyp partners up with an algae, and that algae photosynthesizes, produces carbohydrates, which then the polyp taps into. And for me, both lichens and coral are the textbook example of symbiosis. There are so many
Interesting.
parallels between the two, even though they obviously occupy completely contrasting habitats and ecosystems,
Yes.
that would be the closest resemblance, I would say.
That's cool. Obviously, there's a symbiotic relationship between the two organisms, but
Mm.
what role does the, tree log that they grow on or the stone that they grow on play in this process? Do they have any relationship other than just it's a nice place to sit with those substrates in that context?
Lichens are a self-sustained unit.
Yeah.
The algae has the ability to photosynthesize, and the fungus can then tap into that algae. So when we're talking about the rocks and the trees, the
Mm,
only reason the lichen needs those substrates is for attachment. It just needs somewhere to live. Lichens
gotcha.
don't have a vascular system like lots of plants do. They don't have phloem or xylem, and they don't have roots which actively uptake water and nutrients. Lichens are a sponge, essentially, and they absorb absolutely everything from their surrounding environment, from what they need to survive, so water, nutrients, and minerals. But what they then can't do is differentiate between those necessities and things like toxins and pollutants. And that's what makes
Ah,
lichens such excellent indicators of air quality, because they are a sponge. We call them bioaccumulators. So they just accumulate everything that's going on in their environment. So the stones and the trees are absolutely essential for lichens in terms of attachment, but they don't necessarily take anything from the surface in which they're growing. And what's really cool as well is that they will literally grow on anything. You can guarantee that if you've got a surface, a lichen will eventually grow on it. I've done this little experiment on my car where I haven't washed it for a couple of years, and it's covered in lichens.
Yeah.
It's growing on the rubber seals around the windows. It's growing on the textured cracks where I've reversed my car into a bollard. It's growing in all of the nooks and crannies where there's moisture retained. So
Mm.
if it was dependent on the surface it was growing on for nutrients and water and minerals, then you wouldn't necessarily get them growing on a car, for example.
That's true. Yeah, I actually grew up in far north Queensland, which is a tropical region,
Oh,
and
wow.
you're right. I mean, yeah, people definitely we had them growing on your house, on your car. They were kind of everywhere. In fact, I kind of didn't realize what trees looked like until I kind of grew up and left and went down south, and I was like, oh, there's not kind of like mottling all over them, whereas in the rainforest, it's just they're absolutely everywhere.
Yeah. And they
Um,
do these lichens, they add so much color and texture and beauty to the world
mm,
around us. For me, obviously, they are on the radar and they've been on the radar for such a long period of time. But if you were to leave your front door now, you can more or less guarantee you stand immediately on a lichen where they're growing on the pavements. As you're
mm.
walking down the street, they're growing on the trees, they're growing on people's cars, they're growing on fence posts, they're growing on rock. They're absolutely everywhere. And all of these wonderful habitats that we've got across Britain and Ireland, lichens are a really characteristic component of these places. If we went to the west coast of Scotland and the amazing rainforests up there, you could easily get over 250, 300 species of lichen in one tiny little woodland. So
Wow.
they contribute so significantly to the overarching biodiversity of any site and any habitat in which you explore. And for me, that all starts on your doorstep.
Yeah, well, exactly. I think I was just thinking then, like in the gardening community or in the kind of nature community, we talk about plant blindness, right?
Mm,
But I think probably even people who are interested in nature and gardens have almost like lichen blindness. If they're everywhere, we just don't notice them and see them and appreciate them for what they are. But how many lichen species are there within the UK?
a lot. Within Britain and Ireland alone, there are well over 2,000 species of lichen,
Wow.
which is phenomenal. If you take into account the lichenicolous fungi, which are fungi that parasitize lichens, which are separate from the lichen symbiosis, you're looking at 2,700 species around that number, which is
Gee.
absolutely phenomenal. And like I said, they're just such an important component of every habitat that you go to. Lichens are everywhere and they contribute so much to the biodiversity within this country.
What about the world then? Do you know how many lichens there are on Earth?
How long's a piece of string? I think is
Yeah,
the
yeah.
answer to that question. But the rough number that gets thrown around is between 20 to 30,000 species of lichen.
Wow,
But
yeah,
the problem is
lovely.
with that number is a lot of the taxonomy of lichens, so the lichen, how we go about naming lichens and describing new species,
Mhm.
a lot of that was based on morphology. So the different shapes and features that lichens have and how they
Yeah.
look, basically. But what we're now discovering with this molecular revolution is as we're doing more and more DNA sequencing, species of lichens which we thought belonged to one genus, for example, or one group, now actually belong to 10 different genera or groups.
Good
So
old
the
DNA testing just
good old
blowing everything up for
DNA
us.
testing, exactly. And we're at the point where like under 20% of species within this country have been DNA sequence. So if you think of that on a global scale, there's still so much work that needs to be done.
Yeah.
But alongside that, we're making new discoveries all the time. I have a colleague, going back to Pat, my friend and mentor. She's based at the Natural History Museum and she's just sat on hundreds of undescribed species where she's conducted so much field work in the tropics. So there's so many new species to be described and added to our scientific knowledge. And I think the number is just going to continue to increase over the years as DNA sequencing advances and we spend a lot more time and money getting lichens sequenced.
Probably too much work and too few people doing it at the moment, I'd imagine.
Absolutely right,
Yeah.
Michael. So within, we have a really strong biological recording community in Britain and Ireland, and we have done for a long time. And we're in a very fortunate position, but numbers of lichenologists, unfortunately, are dwindling. And with lichens, they really are a slow burn. They're such a lifelong commitment. And even the experts in this country are still learning and making new discoveries all the time. And a problem that we are facing is that we're not getting people into lichens at a young enough age so they can commit a life to studying them and understanding them. Because they are complex, as I'm sure you're coming to grips with from this conversation, but it's
Definitely.
that complexity which makes them so exciting. And I
Yeah.
know that I'm going to spend a life of learning and feeling constantly perplexed by these wonderful little life forms, and they continue to amaze and fascinate me all the time. And if we can get them on the radar in the public, and if we can get children and teenagers studying these species, I think it gives us a lot of hope in the future.
Where do lichens actually sit in the food chain then?
Lichens play a really important role in ecosystems and within the food chain. It's probably quite a small contribution, but I would still say it's very significant.
Okay.
Lichens, like plants, are producers because they have the ability to make their own food and they have the ability to photosynthesize. And you get lots of beautiful animal lichen interactions where animals are seen feeding directly on lichens or they live amongst these lichens. In this country, they're a really important food source for slugs and snails, so are mollusks, and a lot of moth larvae and caddisfly larvae as well feed directly on lichens. They're very lichen specific in terms of their food source. And then also lots of orobatid mites as well feed directly on lichens too. But if you go further afield into Arctic and subarctic regions, a lot of people are aware that reindeers, or depending where you are, caribou, feed directly on lichens, especially when the snow is up and it covers all of the vascular vegetation which they would normally eat. Lichens then
Right.
become a real staple in the diet of reindeer and caribou, which
They're
is
not only
quite
important to
nice.
these like little tiny creatures, but
So
they're important to
important.
quite large animals as well.
Absolutely. And they are a really important part of their diet. And then obviously you have these herbivores which graze and eat these lichens, and then you've got predators which will then feed on these herbivores. And the same with the small invertebrates in this country. These inverts are a really important food source for birds,
Yeah.
which is yeah. So it all contributes to the food chain
The
basically.
chain just runs up, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and also you've got these decomposers which break lichens down as well. The fungi and the bacteria are, as I said earlier, you have these lichenicolous fungi which are absolute obligates on a lot of these lichen species. And without the lichens there, you wouldn't necessarily get these fungi. So it's really a suite of cascading benefits in the food chain, I think.
Yeah.
But just coming back to the fact how lichens are an ecosystem within their own right. So you have these lichens, you have different species feeding on these lichens, as just discussed. You have invertebrates which live among these lichens, birds which feed on these invertebrates, and then all of these species are interacting with their surrounding habitat. And that is the definition of an ecosystem, which is wonderful.
That is, it's a really cool way to think of it, and I suppose it's very similar in that respect to the coral, to the reefs, as you were mentioning before. Like they kind of almost form the basis of a little ecosystem in themselves.
They really do. And that's why I love studying lichens as well, because when you get into lichens, your walks will never be the same again. Don't think you can walk fast and cover 10 kilometers in a couple of hours. You're spending a couple of hours on a single tree. That's how detailed and intricate these lichens are on the surface.
Wow. And even on like a single tree like that, is there a massive diversity of different species?
Such a diversity. I think the highest number of species that I've ever had on a single tree is over 60
Whoa.
because lichens are extremely specific as to where they grow. They all have their very own ecological niche. And on a single tree, there are so many niches and so many of these little microhabitats which the lichens occupy, because all of
Mm.
these microhabitats are subject to different environmental conditions. The north face of the tree will have different species to the south face of the tree. The dry crevices of the bark will have different species to the more exposed trunk. The
Mm.
branches, the twigs, which are obviously younger, they're subject to higher light levels, will have completely different communities on than the trunk. And Pat, my mentor, she always says, looking at a tree is like looking back in time. You start off on the twigs, which are the youngest part of the tree. You work your way along the branches and down to the trunk, which is the oldest part. And it tells you such an important story about the history of that area, particularly with regards to air pollution. So, whenever you're looking for lichens, these microhabitats are absolutely essential. And the more microhabitats that you have in a habitat, you will get an increased lichen diversity. And that's where management advice comes in when we do these surveys.
2026 is upon us, and I have limited spaces open for my garden coaching and consultation sessions. Whether you're looking for help with plant identification, advice on care and maintenance, or tips for improving your soil and plant nutrition, I'm here to help. As a garden designer, I'll help you think creatively about your outdoor space, offering tools and ideas to give you a fresh perspective on your garden projects. My coaching and consultation sessions can happen right in your garden if you live in the UK, or online if you're anywhere else in the world. My goal is to meet you where you are and support your unique garden journey. Whether you're just starting out, looking to refine your skills, or simply need a second opinion or someone just to bounce ideas off, you have found your space. Head to the link in this episode description or shoot me an email at hello@thegardenerslodge.co.uk. You just dropped a little nugget there about air quality.
Mm.
What do lichens tell us about air quality?
Lichens are the textbook example of bioindication. And what I mean by that is we use different species to make inferences about the quality of the environment in which they're found. And lichens
Mm.
are fantastic at doing that because, going back to what I said earlier, they are essentially a sponge. They cannot differentiate between toxins and pollutants and the necessities that they need for survival. So everything from their environment gets absorbed. And because that's the approach they take, if the quality of the environment in which they're found is poor, that's reflected in the lichens, and vice versa. If the quality of the environment in which they're found is high, again, that completely dictates what species and communities that you find. There's a bit of a misconception with lichens and air pollution, and a lot of people think that in polluted environments, you don't get lichens and you only find lichens in really clean air
Okay.
situations. And there's a little bit of merit to that, but it's also slightly more complicated. You actually find lichen species and communities occupying both polluted and non polluted situations. But what happens is you just get different species and communities. So, in an area where you have high nitrogen pollution, for example, you will have a collection of species that are well adapted to that environment. Whereas in areas where you've got extremely clean air, you will have a collection of species that are extremely sensitive, which occupy that sort of habitat. So when it comes to air pollution, it's more the presence or absence of certain species allows us to make inferences about the quality of the air. But it's not just air pollution either. We can use lichens to indicate the quality of water, and we can use them to indicate the quality of woodlands. They're fantastic ancient woodland indicators because they're so slow at growing and they're really poor at colonizing. And there's this amazing index which we use called the Indices of Ecological Continuity. And it's basically using certain species of lichen to try and work out if a woodland is of ancient origin or not.
Oh, again, I'm mind blown. That is fascinating. They sound like such important indicators that can tell us so much about the world around us that we just ignore. I think that kind of brings us to my next point. In garden spaces, when I've gone into clients' gardens, or not as much anymore, but I would say a few years ago, people used to come and say, "What is this on my tree? It's hurting it, or it's a disease, or it's a fungus, or like we need to chop it down," or something like that. What can I do? And I think that would kind of come back to education and not understanding what they are, not understanding their importance of it, of them. How can we change people's minds about lichens and get them thinking about them as a object of beauty?
You're absolutely right with what you said, Michael. A lot of this boils down to education, and there is a bit of a misconception with gardeners, and it's understandably so, that lichens actually harm the trees or harm the surfaces in which they're growing on. And
Yeah.
if your gardening community can take one thing from this podcast, it's that lichens absolutely don't do that. And what people tend to see in their gardens is they might see a tree that is dying, which is absolutely covered in lichens, and straight away they attribute it to the lichens as to why the tree has died. But what happens is that the tree dies, it drops its leaves, which increases the light levels to the bark. And then the lichens just grow in luxuriance because they're so light dependent. And, light is such
Mm.
a driving force within these ecosystems. And lichens respond so positively that it's actually the other way round, that the tree dies first and then the lichens move in. But coming back to what I said a second ago, lichens are such poor colonizers and they grow so slowly. So if you have lichens in your garden or lichens in the environment, it's really reflective of very positive management, low disturbance, long continuity, and it's definitely something that should be appreciated on your local patch, in your lawn, in your back garden,
And
because
protected.
so protected, absolutely, because these lichens they play such an important role within the ecosystem, and again they just add to the beauty of these places. They're absolutely stunning. And I feel with lichens, obviously you can appreciate them from a distance, but it's not until you get up really close to them that you realize just how beautiful they are. And as lichenologists, we go around with a times 10 magnification hand lens. So
Yeah.
this hand lens allows you to see 10 times bigger than what you see with the naked eye. And you just delve into a completely different world when you have access to one of these hand lenses. And you can pick them up for about £2.50 off of the internet. They're such a bargain. And I
Okay.
encourage all of your community to go out and buy one and just take a step out into their gardens and to try and understand what they've got. They might have, I don't know, 50 to 100 different plant species, which rightly so, people should really pride. But on top of that, you've probably got 20 to 30 to 40 different lichen species as well. So it just adds to the biodiversity of the garden, in my opinion.
Completely. And as you're saying, they're a part of the food web. So they're promoting beneficials coming into the space and building that biodiversity that I think everyone's trying to move towards in the gardening space at the moment.
Another way to look at it as well, I think, is that when all the flowers finish in the summer and you just have your garden of green leaves, which is often the case in the autumn and winter time, these lichens are there all year round. They're not necessarily seasonal in the slightest. So you
Mm.
can still have splashes of colour in your garden even in the winter time. And I think that's another really nice way of looking at them.
That is actually really cool too, because you're right. There are so many different colors. You can get like quite bright colored lichens, kind of in that reddy, yellowy, orangey tones, as well as kind of standard greeny colors. But that's the perfect
Absolutely.
way to look at it.
Yeah, and just while we're on colour, so the reason lichens are such different colours is due to a variety of different reasons. A lot of lichens that we have are green, and obviously that is because of the algal component in the lichen. But when these lichens start partnering up with cyanobacteria, you can get these really vibrant purple colours and brown
Oh,
colours, and some of them are very bluish in colour. But alongside the photobiont, so the algae or the cyanobacteria, lichens are also jam packed with chemicals. And we call these chemicals secondary metabolites. And across lichens, I think there's over 700 different chemicals that have been formally described from lichens. And these chemicals give lichens fantastic colors. There's a really common one called the sunburst lichen, which you find in towns and cities. It's all over the twigs. And that bright yellow color is due to a chemical pigment which we call parietin. And that yellow color actually protects the lichen from the sunshine. So if you look at a twig, the top of it will be
oh,
bright, bright yellow because it's protecting the lichen body from the sun. But then if you look on the underside of the twig, it's actually a greeny color because it doesn't need that chemical pigment there to protect it from the sun because it's already shaded. And producing these chemicals is very energetically expensive. So these lichens distribute it as to where they need it. But if you were then to put that twig upside down and leave it out in the sunshine, the chemicals would redistribute, and what was once a green grey colour would then turn to yellow because it's now exposed to the sunshine, which is insane.
that is really cool.
Really cool. And these chemicals are really something that particularly interested and excited me when I first got into lichens. Is that these chemicals, which we call secondary metabolites, they have a suite of biomedical properties. They've been shown to have um, antimicrobial properties, antifungal
Mm,
properties, antibacterial qualities as well. And going back to that sunburst lichen, that parietin which is produced has actually been shown to inhibit and halt and slow down the growth of tumour cells in laboratory conditions. So the
really?
pharmaceutical potential of these lichens is absolutely huge, and it's so underexplored as well. These chemists know way more about lichen chemicals than what us lichenologists do. And
Yeah.
it's a field of science that I would love people to get into because, if you think about fungi, so many chemicals have been extracted for them, which we use in the pharmaceutical industry. Think of penicillin, for example.
Mm.
But with lichens, it's so underexplored. And I just feel there's so many discoveries yet to be made with
Waiting
lichen
to happen.
chemistry. Absolutely.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, of course, when Big Pharma wants to get involved into something, discoveries will be made and probably made quite quickly with these types of things. I
Definitely.
just hope it goes down a, sustainable route
Mm,
where environments are protected while that's happening at the same time. Uh,
absolutely. And we're just, I think as technology advances, lichens will become more and more to the forefront, but you can't plant lichens in a monoculture like you could with a plant. So it's actually
no.
really hard to extract and synthesize these chemicals on a large enough scale to apply for human testing. But in the future, when this technology advances, I think there's going to be some really exciting movements in that sector.
Absolutely. What about cultural and historical uses of lichens? we've evolved with them and they've evolved with us. How have we in the past used them?
There is a really long and beautiful cultural history of humans interacting with lichens. And the most renowned one is lichens as a food source. And I just want to
Cool.
cover my back and that of the British Lichen Societies. I'm not advocating for people to eat lichens, and I would actually
Sure.
discourage it
Okay.
because some lichens are safe to eat. But what I must stress is that other lichens are actually poisonous. So it's really outside my area of expertise, and probably a forager would know more about it than what I do.
Okay.
But there are quite a few examples of lichens being used as food. And there's this species that we have in this country, which belongs to the family Umbilicariaceae, or the Latin is Lacalia pustulata, which is the rock tripe. And this is a species which is characteristic of acid rock in upland situations. And it's been documented in the past that it's been eaten by mountaineers in times of food shortage, where they've
Mm.
actually boiled up this rock tripe and eaten it. I can't imagine it being very nice though.
Yeah, I was going to say.
And this family, the Umbilicariaceae, um, it's actually eaten all across the globe, particularly in Asian food culture, where it's seen as a real delicacy, and it's harvested off these rocks and eaten. And when you go to Asian markets in London, I really encourage you to go actually, as you're based in that neck of the woods. You
Yeah.
get these lichen spice packets where these lichens are used as flavor enhancers and spices used in cooking, which is quite nice.
Oh, have you
Another,
had any? Have you tried them?
do you know what? I've never tried any. No,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I haven't, but
No, that's okay.
it would be. I'd be really interested to know if anyone has and what they thought about it and how it changed the food that they eat. And
Yeah.
another species we have in this country is called the Icelandic moss, even though it's not a moss, it's a lichen called
Mhm.
Citraria icelandica, and this is famously known for being drunk as Icelandic tea. So the lichen's put in hot water and then it's drank as tea, which is quite a nice concept. But lichens, they've long been used in traditional medicine. And there's
Okay.
this wonderful concept called the doctrine of signatures. The doctrine of signatures is this concept which herbalists use where parts of the natural world, such as plants, fungi, lichens, they are used in medicine, in herbal medicine. If they resemble different parts of the body, they can be used to treat minor ailments. And there's this lovely lichen called Liberia pulmonaria, or the lungwort lichen. And that species is meant to resemble lung tissue. And again, it was boiled up and it was
Ah,
drunk to treat respiratory problems, which is really interesting. And
that is interesting. What about perfumes? Are they scented at all?
yeah, so yeah, another really good point. So these secondary metabolites, these chemicals that are found in lichens, are also used in the perfume industry.
Oh, they are.
They are used in the perfume industry, yep. And they're also used, lichens are also used as dyes as well, to dye materials, to dye walls, for example. And the actual color of the lichen, when you first see it, they produce completely different colors as dyes. And there's this
Okay.
wonderful lichen, which we get all over the UK. It's called Ochrolechia tartaria. It's best developed in the West. And up in Scotland, this species was harvested on quite a large scale. And it's white in appearance with these little orange fruits, but it produces this bright purple dye. And it was actually used to dye kilts in Scotland to get that purple colour for the certain clans up there, which is nice.
But what kind of threats are lichens under today?
Unfortunately, lichens are subject to a wide range of threats. Some of them are very large scale threats, and others are much more site specific. So, in terms of the large scale threats that they face, climate change is always going to be a big one, as it is with other taxonomic groups.
Yeah.
Air pollution is particularly pertinent with lichens as well. And also, in terms of woodland lichens, these tree pests and diseases that are coming in all of the time have the
Mm.
ability to really significantly influence and shape where lichens are found in this country.
I
Um,
suppose habitat destruction as well for farmlands and
that's it. Habitat destruction, habitat loss, habitat degradation. Lichens are so sensitive to change in their environment. And unfortunately, with a lot of these anthropogenic changes, these lichens simply cannot cope with how rapidly they're happening. And what happens with that, if they cannot cope and they cannot adapt quick enough, then they are simply lost. And we are seeing more and more lichens creep onto our British and Irish red lists, where they are now high conservation concern due to these habitat changes. And then at the site scale, so the biggest one that we face, be working in a woodland or up on a mountain or in a nice grassland, for example, is to do with the light levels and the loss of light. And many of these habitats are becoming increasingly shaded and
mm,
outcompeted. So if you have lots of bramble moving into a habitat, or holly encroachment, or increased levels of ivy, this vascular vegetation just completely overshades lichens, because they can't compete against something that's so much bigger than them.
yeah.
So light is a real driving force in these habitats, and unfortunately, they're becoming increasingly shaded. So with these larger scale issues, they're really hard to address because a real landscape scale approach is needed to conserve habitats across the countryside. But these site level issues can certainly be addressed by land managers or landowners, and that's where we really encourage and try to promote these bespoke conditions that lichens love.
So does the British Lichen Society help landowners promote the health of their lichen?
We at the British Lichen Society do everything we can do to meet our main aims and objectives, and that is to promote the enjoyment of lichens, but also their conservation as well. And
Okay.
across the society, we have about 700 members, both within Britain and Ireland, but also overseas as well. And I always think we're like this quirky camaraderie of folks that are just
Yeah.
completely besotted by lichens. And it's absolutely wonderful when we all come together. Our website contains a wealth of information, from habitat management, on how to identify lichens, on how to get involved with the society. So I really encourage your community to explore our website, because there's so many fantastic opportunities and so much amazing information there which people can learn from.
And that's the britishlichensociety.org.uk.
Correct. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. But just to say, I actually chair the Education and Promotions Committee for the British
Mm.
Lichen Society. And this committee, which I'm so fortunate enough to chair, we're all really dedicated to raising the profile and awareness of lichens. So, again, just thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
No, of course.
And if you go on the Learning tab on the British Lichen Society's website, there's lots of really useful information that people could read to learn more about lichens, because we only have an hour together today, and I've only
Exactly.
scratched the surface with how wonderful lichens are. So there's lots more information to be found on our website. Various social media platforms. So we're on Twitter, we're on YouTube. So if people want to hear more or want to get involved, then please follow us on those platforms as well.
April, thank you so, so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate the work of the British Lichen Society. Thank you so much for educating me. I've said it probably 3 times now, but my mind has been blown. It's so full of information. And I can't wait to dive even deeper into the world of lichen.
Michael, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast, and also the British Lichen Society. And just thank you for everything that you're doing with your
Oh,
podcast.
thank
It's
you.
really amazing.
Thank you so much for joining me today. If you like the show, don't forget to hit the follow or subscribe button. Tell a friend or two, or maybe even give the show a 5-star rating and a review. If you want more Gardener's Lodge content, you can find our website, our Instagram and our TikTok in the show notes below this episode. The Gardener's Lodge podcast is a growing media production.